Well, Mike, welcome to the podcast. I'm so thankful to have you on. How are you doing today?
Great. Thank you, Keith. I'm so delighted to be here with you.
Good. I'm going to ask you my favorite question I ask all my guests. What is the best piece of advice you've ever received?
One that stands out to me is when I started my career, just after getting an engineering degree, I went to work for Procter and Gamble, and they told me pay attention to the customer.
Mm,
And it's a foundational idea that set the rest of my business career up because I ended up working in high tech. It's high tech is not famous for doing that. Some big fortunes have been made with well, Scott Cook was there. He's the guy that founded Intuit that makes Quicken, the software.
sure.
He
Yeah.
he used that principle, and a number of other people went from there to use that idea, and in eBay and other places like that made great companies. The broader idea from it, though, is that you should listen more than tell. And this is going to resonate in what I think we're going to talk about today about polarization and balance and respect and things like that. We all have our ideas. We think they're right. And if we start from a position of telling other people what they need to know that we know already, we're behind the
Yes.
eight ball. And P&G pretty much starts out saying, I don't care what you think. I want to know what the customer thinks. And it reorients everything.
I love that. I'm curious. People like yourself who've achieved certain levels in their career always, I think, have people in their lives who have been important to them. Who are some people in your life who maybe served as a mentor for you or inspired you on your journey?
The biggest one of those would be my uncle, whose name was Bill Steele. He was an electrical engineer. I was born into a family of engineers, but they were mostly farm mechanics and auto mechanics. They were uneducated engineers, and they had good lives, but not really advanced ones. Bill quit a dead-end job, went back to get his double E degree, and then he worked on the IBM team that invented the barcode scanners that we all use everywhere.
Wow.
So when he came to our house, he could fix everything that my mother had piled up for him for months. And I just thought, I want to be Bill Steele. And that's why I went to Georgia Tech to study electrical engineering. And, my path diverged from that in a way we can discuss if you like. But Bill was a big influence on me because he could fix everything. And I just wanted to be able to do that.
I love that. So you kind of mentioned it. Kind of give us a little bit about your background. I'm curious. I looked at your bio, and it was a fascinating journey. Even though you went to Georgia Tech, I'm from Louisiana. We won't hold that against you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
But tell us about your background.
Well, I mentioned I was born into a family of engineers on my mother's side. I was born in West Tennessee in a little town. My family moved to Nashville when I was 2, so I grew up in Nashville. Went to Georgia Tech, and about 2 years into that, I felt like I was being trained for a profession rather than being educated more generally, because one of my basic characteristics is curiosity. Curious about art, about music, about philosophy, about humanities, about history, and also about technology and building machines and things like that. So I started thinking about the role of humanities in a technical education, and that sort of shaped the rest of my life because I got the degree. I didn't want to abandon that credential. I decided not to go to Silicon Valley, but rather to go to business school. So I got a deferred admission to Harvard Business School because I was asking that question about the education I was getting. I was thinking beyond the received wisdom in the box that had put myself in. And so they liked that. And I had 2 years to work somewhere. So that's when I went to Procter and Gamble. I learned the lesson that I just mentioned, and I also met my wife. So we married and moved off to Boston. So I decided I really didn't like big companies. I'm too independent. I don't like people telling me, looking over my shoulder all the time and telling me what to do. So I spent my career in early stage startups and have loved it, ran an incubator, et cetera. But that's basically the shape of my career. I moved back to Tennessee after a first venture-backed initiative in Boston area on integrated software. Back when, what Office became, we had a version of that, and we're a competitor to Microsoft doing that. But I worked with Steve Ballmer at Procter and Gamble. He ended up president of Microsoft. You know, Other people like him were there, getting that background that they took into high tech and made great strides with.
I love that. So, what inspired you to write Deep Trade Offs?
So at about age 40, I had this aha moment. I had started a business called Knowledge Products, which reflects what I've just told you. I was interested in the humanities. I had a business partner who had gotten a degree at Vanderbilt, and then he realized he majored in graduating. The easiest path to get there was what he was after, and he left a lot of cards on the table, things he could have learned and didn't. And he got to middle age and found himself sort of wandering in how what he believed, who he found credible, who he didn't. So I met him and I thought this is a great idea for a new business. So we made audio cassettes on the great ideas of history, political thought, economics, science, philosophy, religion. And at about age 40, I was working on a project called Moral Problems of Our Age. Terrorism, war, euthanasia, abortion, drugs, alcohol, you know the list. And I realized that the problems we were talking about were not problems of the kind I had been trained to solve. There was no algorithm, there was no formula, there was no equation, there's no structured decision process that's going to get to a right answer, right? There are many right
Right.
answers in that case. And I came to see these problems as conflicting truths. There are values, each of which has worth, is valid, but they don't fit well together. Freedom and equality is one. The freer we are, the less equal we are, because we go to very different places, different toleration for risk, different abilities, different circumstances. The more you have equality, the more you have to really squash freedom. That's just one example. And so I thought about this for 20 years and then wrote the book that I published last year, Deep Trade-Offs. And it's about these value conflicts that we all know about, but we generally don't think about very much. We're dealing with them subconsciously, but not generally with our forebrains, with our rational mind. It's instinctive.
I love that. So, as you wrote this book, what were you hoping people would take away or gain from reading this book?
Well, I spent 4 years writing it and 20 years thinking about it. And it's just because I was curious about this way of understanding reality and truth. How do things work? And during that 4 years, I came to see that this is really behind one of the big problems of our age, which is polarization and our alienation from one another, our hostility to somebody else, usually because we think that we're right and they're wrong. And sometimes that goes to there must be evil or they must be stupid because they don't see the light. And this is a formula for not getting along with people. And so part of what I've learned and learned to articulate in thinking about this is that relationships come first. You know, we don't solve our problems by shouting other people down. They dig in their heels and fight us back. And so the first principle is to understand that people are generally not stupid. They're generally not evil. They have different ideas than we do, and trying to understand them and balance them with our own ideas is a great opportunity.
So, you talk about some balance and peace of mind in your book
Yes.
in a polarized world. Can you elaborate more on that approach? I like the idea of balance and peace of mind, but kind of tell us, develop that out for us a little bit more.
Well, you know, it's a pretty common observation today that people are alienated, they're angry, they're polarized, they don't talk to one another, they fight at Thanksgiving. And it's because they think that other people are wrong and they're out to get them, right?
Right.
One of the points I make in the book is that conflict is not the problem. Conflict is natural and inevitable. It's been going on since the dawn of man. A religious person would say it's been going on since Adam and Eve. You know, a patriot would say it's been going on since the founding fathers. A historian would say it's been going on for all of recorded history. It's just built into human nature. We're different. We have conflicts. The problem is coercion, where I'm going to make you live by my ideas. That's the problem. And vice versa. If I think that you ought to follow my uh, priorities, I think is a good word to use. I suppose my priorities, they're all ideas, they're all values, but every value has a rival. That's another kind of idea that I've been pursuing. I've made a list of 300 values looking up on the internet, value inventories, and I combined them and deduplicated them. And I went through all of them, and I think I could say for every value on that list, I can identify a rival, a competitor, one that undercuts that value in some circumstances.
So I love that, and you're that's right. I just watched a show just recently with a conservative and a liberal on a discussing just kind of the big ideas of our time. And it was funny to listen kind of come to some agreement on some things, but of course there's some things they just don't see eye to eye on.
Sure.
As you talk about those conflicting values and things that divide us in your book, Deep Trade-Offs, how do you suggest readers navigate these conflicts in their life so that we can have conversation and ultimately get to the point where we have balance and peace of mind?
Well, it starts with awareness. We've touched on that earlier. We tend to not recognize that this is maybe a solvable problem if we listen to one another and understand tension and leave tension in how we live. We tend to think that these conflicts shouldn't happen, that they are problems that need to be solved and can be solved. Back to my insight at age 40, they are not going to be solved. They are perpetual. Our founders of our country knew this very well. And the Constitution is saturated with ideas for balancing conflict and checks and balances and all of the stuff that we studied in history. They were very wise about human nature and about factions, about people. Or as long as people are free, especially if they're free, as long as they're human, they're going to have different interests, different priorities, and organize to pursue those priorities. People care about these things. That's another way of looking at conflict, is because people care about things and they think they should be different. So, chapter 2 in my book is about ideals and reality. I think the world ought to be X way. You think it ought to be Y way, and one of your listeners thinks it ought to be Z way. And we all have these ideals of way things should be, and the point is they're never going to be that way. They're going to be some mix of what I think and what you think and what somebody else thinks, because they're all truths. They're all legitimate values, or based on legitimate values.
So as you did research this book, I know when I've done research in mine, I find some interesting things that I wasn't aware of. What was the most shocking thing you discovered in your research for this book?
Well, the thing that comes to mind when you ask that question is a quote that I ran into when I was doing the philosophy as part of our publications at Knowledge Products, our audio presentations. Friedrich Nietzsche said that conviction is a greater foe of truth than lies. This made no sense to me. I thought there's beliefs which you hold tentatively. They may be overturned at some point but then there's truths which have been proven, by science and evidence and things like that at the other end of the spectrum. And in the middle is convictions, which I sort of thought of as hardened beliefs and soft truths, kind of in the middle. And Nietzsche overturned that. And it took me years to figure it out. But what I've come to understand or believe about that is that he's saying that if we have really hard convictions, we've closed our minds to listening to other people and competitive ideas that may undermine our convictions. So like the great baseball pitcher Satchel Paige is credited as saying, it's not what you know, what you don't know that is a problem. It's what you know that's not true.
Right.
We know lots of things that need to be qualified, in some cases overturned, but an open mind is one that is receptive to that kind of being alive, that kind of changing and growing.
And like the great Yogi Berra said, nobody comes here more because this restaurant's too busy.
That's right. He was great. Fantastic. Love Yogi Berra.
So you have over 300 quotes that for a wide range of sources in your books. How did you select these quotes? I'm sure you had way more than 300 you could have put in. So how did you narrow it down to that and select that approach to your topic?
Yeah, first of all, when we did Knowledge Products, that we had an innovation there that we were producing like an audio magazine where a narrator would kind of give a narrative flow, a line, a story, and it would be populated with quotes from people that were involved in the story we're telling. So if it's a giants of political thought. We're talking about, say, the Federalist Papers and James Madison, John Jay, and Alexander Hamilton hire actors to characterize those people and to tell the story of the Federalist Papers and how it was designed to manage factions, as I mentioned. That's one of 140 productions we did over about 12 years. And so each production had about 100 quotes in it for a 3-hour audio presentation. 140 times 100 is what, about 14,000?
Yeah.
So I started with that. And then I had 20 years of pursuing this idea of deep trade-offs, of what became deep trade-offs. So that's another few thousand quotes. And so I basically sort them into categories. And then when I write a chapter on, say, equality or liberty, or being centralized or decentralized, being clear or ambiguous, those are kind of abstract, but I have dozens of quotes that are in favor of one or the other, transparency or privacy.
Right.
Right? You see the idea.
I do.
Yeah.
Which of those subjects that you wrote about was the most difficult for you to write about?
Well, the book has 3 chapters, plus, 4 chapters, 3 trade-offs, and then a 4th one about what to do about them. And the last one is a collection of a lot of people's ideas about process, tactics, how we behave to deal with conflict. That's the way a lot of books and magazine articles talk about it. The chapters are trying to get at something deeper, which is to recognize an ambivalence, an equivocation at the very nature of things, that these are seesaws all over that we're riding and not quite aware of it. So actually, one of the funnest of those 3 was about honesty and deception. Let's take a poll. Who's for honesty and who's for deception? We kind of know who's going to win that one, right?
Right.
But the truth is, we deceive all the time, most of all ourselves. And sometimes it's for good purposes because there are other values at stake. For instance, we deceive our children around this time of year because it brings them joy, right?
Right.
We deceive people so they won't be harmed by some truth, like you come upon a traffic accident, somebody's bleeding out, you say it's going to be all right, you calm them down, very well the odds are they're going to die, right? And there's stories from World War II and others where people lied to protect Jews who were under threat. Most of us as moral beings would defend that and say it is appropriate to lie in that circumstance. But there's a number of values that take precedence over truth and honesty. One of them is preventing harm. One of them may be privacy in some cases, sometimes preserving a surprise, for later benefit. And so once we realize that no value trumps everything else, then there's a great enterprise before us to sort of think through what are the values involved and how do they line up against one another in this particular situation.
I'm curious, what kind of feedback are you receiving on the book?
Well, there's about 50 something reviews on Amazon, and I think most of them are 5-star. People really like this way of thinking, and I think they see it as an opening to getting along with other people. It troubles some people that it may be suggesting that truths are not solid, that there are not truths in an absolute sense with a big T.
Right.
And that is a rich philosophical vein to explore. I do think that truths are circumstantial. There's lots of different kinds of truth. This is one of the things I'm working on now to write further about it. But there's logical truth, there's symbolic truth, there's psychological truth, there's religious truth, there's scientific truth, legal truth. They're all different. They have different standards of getting to truth in each of those situations, but they're all truths in some meaningful way.
So as you think about this book, as I always think, I've done books too, and everything's published and it's all out there. If you could go back, is there something you would change in your book?
Well, I did change toward the end. I had 5 chapters involved, and it was just too long.
Right.
And so I narrowed it down to just 3 trade-offs plus this 4th short chapter I mentioned. And so it's a 200-page book. The point was to make it digestible. And so there's a lot of other books that I want to write. If there's an audience for this, there's a lot more to say about other trade-offs that have not been addressed in this 200-page book. So in one sense, it's a huge scope in the topic of subject matter. But the challenge is making it accessible and readable and clearly understandable. I just got a note from a friend who said he had read it twice because there's just so much to absorb. He felt the need to do it the second time. And I love that. I do think it is a thing that you can go back to and get something new out of every time, because these are really some great quotes from some of history's, best thinkers.
I love that.
So yeah, in terms of doing something differently, I think I've done the best that I could with that one. There's a lot more to do.
So you say there's some trade-offs you think you want to tackle next. What are some of those trade-offs you want to tackle in a future book?
Well, I mentioned centralized and decentralized, open and closed. There's a reason to have a closed mind about certain things. I'm not really open to having extramarital affairs. I have a
Right.
very happy marriage, and I don't consider that a desirable form of an open mind. Anthony Bourdain, who nobody would call a conservative, have some great quotes from him about how comfortable he is in the kitchen and how he likes being around things that he knows and understands and that reassure him. That's a form of a closed mind. So, there's mostly benefits to open mind. We've already talked about those, but there's also reasons not to and circumstances not to. One that particularly interests me is focus and sensitivity. They cannot happen at the same time. My mother is pretty clear to me has ADD, never diagnosed. They didn't know about it when she was young. My son had ADD that he grew out of. I'm the opposite scale between those generations. So I'm hyper focused, and people wouldn't come into my office when I was working on audio products scripts, knowledge product scripts, and I wouldn't know they came in. So focused on what I was doing that I didn't hear or see them. As a teenager, my mother would talk to me and I didn't respond because I was in the groove, and she would really get angry. Like, you're ignoring me. And no, I'm not just ignoring, I didn't hear you. It was shut off. And so I have those personal experiences to be able to see that focus and sensitivity are incompatible, and it basically ends up being about attention. Where do we put our attention? And we live in a world that's where attention is in short supply. It's overburdened. There's too many things to pay attention to. So what do we ignore? What do we savor? Big questions for our psychological lives. Does
Yeah,
that
that is
help?
no, it's
You guys,
fascinating. No,
yeah,
I'm thinking about that because you're right. There's those two things are direct tension with each other.
right. They're
And there's so
both,
many others. Yeah,
yeah, you have to do them both. It's not like either one can be ruled out and win or lose.
right.
As one person said about our form of government in the United States, is this genius is that nobody ever permanently wins.
Exactly.
And so everybody is in it, and so things keep rebalancing and rebalancing. That is a form of health. It's a form of ongoing conflict. We should be grateful for this rather than resentful for it.
And you're right, because the founding fathers were brilliant in the fact that they designed tension in the governing system, so that one particular side shouldn't have total control. There should be balance,
That's right. And so
which
there's
drives us
30
all
of these.
crazy.
Yeah. There's 30 of these deep trade-offs that I've identified, and I keep finding, like duty and entitlement.
Mm,
You end up talking about rights in there. There's a lot to say about rights. Rights is in conflict with democracy.
right. Yeah.
Democracy is about voting on how we're going to do things, right? And rights are designed, natural rights are observations about things that people shouldn't be forced to do. If 51% vote to reimpose slavery, can't do that.
Right.
It's a natural right not to be enslaved, right? I saw an article the other day that the Montana Supreme Court has declared that there's a right in the Montana Constitution to have a safe environment. Well, nature doesn't provide that. Nature will kill you within a few months if you
Yes.
stay outside, right? It's not a
Exactly.
natural right. It's a state right. And so some sophisticated understanding of what is a statutory right, what's a natural right, what's a moral right. Because these days people tend to think, I want something and therefore it is right and it is a right.
Yes,
That's
exactly.
bad logic.
It is bad logic, and I love how you bring that up because I don't think we think that way. That those tensions aren't necessarily bad. It's okay. How do we just like you said? How do we have balance and peace of mind with that tension?
Right, right. And recognize that, Keith may have a different conclusion than I do, and that's okay. And he might be right.
Right.
You start with the idea that how can I accept what somebody else is saying? What can I find that's true in it and maybe improve myself? There's really a great psychological idea here. There's psychologist Jonathan Haidt who talks about the motivated reasoning and the confirmation bias and a generally defensive way of responding to challenges to our ideas. We dig in our heels and we fight when we're challenged. And he said we're behaving in that way like a lawyer or a soldier. We're out to win, right? He said the better mechanism is to behave like a scout or a judge. A scout is looking for the truth. You're going to die if you don't get a correct assessment of the battlefield out there, right? So if you get if you identify a misperception, you're better off, right? You better find your mistakes and change them. And that's a better frame of mind for this. That we're not all right. We need to grow. We need to improve, and we don't start from a position that everything that we've decided is the right way.
So have you sent this book off to your Congress people so they can read it?
I have not. I have a friend who wrote the foreword. He was a candidate for governor in Vermont years back, and he says every councilman and senator and representative ought to read this. That's, I think, kind of a fool's errand for me to suggest they're going to follow any suggestion like that. It's hard these days because people don't read as much as they used to, and the ones that do read have so many options. There's a lot of great stuff out there.
Right.
And so it makes it hard to publish a book and get attention for it. Those are, publishing a book is about a third of the effort. Getting attention for it, and having people understand why it's worth their commitment and time, or persuaded why that's their commitment of time, is hard.
I love that. I love to ask my guests this question. I'm enjoying this conversation immensely. But I'm curious, as you think about this book and what you're doing in this sphere of your life, what do you want your legacy to be?
Well, I have thought that if I can have a part in promoting this more even-handed way of thinking, eventually it gets to getting away from right and wrong, good and bad. Good and bad is one of the future chapters. There's evil and bad, and et cetera. It's a complicated topic in philosophy, and making a rich discussion of it accessible is a challenge I'd like to address. But I think all of this taken together, if I could have some influence on changing people's mindset, I think it would reduce the amount of anxiety and alienation and stress that we have. I think it would bring more peace of mind and joy to people. Um, and that's something I'd really like to accomplish. I think my lifetime is not long enough to do it. If I could plant some seeds that germinate over the decades, maybe a lot faster than that. I don't have a control over that, but that's really what I'd like to accomplish with this work, this way of thinking.
I'm curious when you just mentioned good and evil. I wonder how different that discussion is in a theological perspective versus a philosophical or political perspective, because I think it's probably a different conversation. So you even have topics there that if you break them down based on the area that you're looking at it from, is probably also a different conversation.
Exactly, and that's part of the challenge. In knowledge products, we did a history of China in 3 hours. That's
Okay.
2,000 years. You've got to leave a lot of stuff out. But
Right.
what you have left needs to be rich and have a lot of layers where you see ways to probe particular things, but you say something in 10 words and move on. And that the way that kind of conversation would have to be. One of the trade-offs is for a future chapter is belief and skepticism, which sort of goes to your question. If you start with a position of belief, some people think that truths in what is good, what is valuable is given to us. It's revealed to us in a religious way. Scientists don't think that at all. They have to have evidence.
Right.
So faith and evidence are big competitors.
Yes, exactly.
Okay. And I think there are different kinds of truth. There are religious truths that are not backed by evidence. We just don't have the evidence for a lot of those things, and that's okay. I believe them and I live my life by them. I'm active religiously. I'm an elder
Right.
in my church. But they're not scientific truths. They're not legal truths. And I think a mature way of coming to terms with this is to see all of these as valid ways of thinking, some of which I might prioritize over other because I think it gives me a better life.
Exactly. So, as we wrap up our conversation, what key takeaways do you want the audience to gather from our conversation today?
Two things come to mind. One is symmetry. If you remember the word symmetry, always look for the other side of the seesaw. Pretty much any of these problems that we address, instead of asserting that our side of it is right and the other side is wrong or evil, look for the value in the other side and find symmetry, find balance. Once you start thinking in terms of symmetry, it's much easier to get to some balanced perspective. The other one is that relationships come before agreement, not the other way around. We hear about people who won't talk to somebody else because they don't agree and they're going to suffer by fighting. Um, we don't have to fight. I've got people who believe very different things than I do politically, and we just talk about something else. We like each other. We laugh with each other. Sometimes we avoid it. Sometimes there's a time for engaging. Uh, but relationships come first, and people are not shoved into change. They're loved into change. So, Keith, if I got to know you really much better than the brief history that we have in our relationship, it's much more likely that you're going to change my mind or I'm going to change yours if we trust and like each other.
Right. That's amazing. Is there anything I haven't asked you that I should have asked you?
Well, in 30 minutes, no, I think you've hit some really good high points, but there's plenty of other stuff to talk about. There's a lot of tentacles of this kind of thinking, a lot of implementations of it. But, I think we've hit some pretty good key points today.
No, it's a fascinating book, and I think you've brought up some things that I think we have lost sight of in our daily discourse. That there's tensions in our connections, our relationships, even in our conversations that need to be there, and we really need to honor the fact that there are tensions, and not try to either run away from it or create a sense of anxiety or animosity because of those tensions.
Yeah, exactly. And the fascinating thing about this is not all that great a surprise to people.
Right.
It's just not like you're overturning your world. It's like you're recognizing something you already knew but weren't thinking about very deeply. And sometimes there's great surprises in it, and a lot of times as one reader said, it's like seeing your nose. It's been there all along, but I haven't noticed it in years.
Right, exactly. So where can people find your book, Deep Trade-Offs, and connect with you on social media?
The book is available on Amazon. It's also available in bookstores. A distributor will carry it, but you generally have to order it. The bookstore these days just can't carry all of the books that are being published in a year, much less backlists and stuff like that. So Amazon is a great place. Do have a website, deeptradeoffs.com. People can leave a message for me there. I do have a Facebook page. I don't really use social media for promoting the book. I long ago kind of concentrated my time and attention to writing this stuff and researching more instead of getting active on Twitter and X and things like that. I thought Twitter, when it came out, was just the worst idea ever. Why do I want to hear 100 character responses to everything that happens every day from millions of people? I don't have time for that. I don't have attention for that.
Right.
And so you won't find me on Instagram or Twitter. I've never tweeted and I've never posted on Instagram. But I do use email and phones. And if somebody wants to reach me, they can leave a message on deeptradeoffs.com.
That's amazing. So, Mike, again, thank you so much for taking the time to being on here, and thank you for doing this work. Because, like you said, it's like kind of realizing your nose has been there all along, but you just ignored it. It's a great place for us to start to think about how we interact with each other and how we can interact in a way that we don't have to walk away hating someone who disagrees with us, but can recognize that we can have difference of opinion and still respect each other's opinions. So I appreciate this conversation and what you've done and the work you're continuing to do on this important topic.
Well, thank you. And I appreciate you helping me get the word out about it. And any of your listeners who want to join that, I'd welcome it.
Thank you so much, Mike.
Thank you.